Andrew, how are you? Hey, before we get started here, I just want you to know that I recently entered my podcast into a competition at the Astrologers Association of America. Now, I didn't come in first place, but they did give me a constellation prize.
Oh,
terrible. Constellation prize.
Constellation prize. That's really elegant.
Yeah.
They saw the sign.
That's right. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Anyways. Oh my God. You have a joke. You say that you might have an astrology joke. Please tell.
You know how the moon gets a haircut?
Eclipse it.
Eclipse it. How does Jupiter throw a really great party?
How?
He planned it.
Right.
He planned it.
I actually have a risque astrology joke. You ready for? Here we go.
Risque astrology jokes. We like them.
Hopefully, it's not that risque. But I had a friend who was the astrological sign Cancer, and they recently passed away, and their death is kind of ironic because they were killed by a giant crab.
Oh no.
So that's
killed by a crab.
Killed by a giant crab. Anyways, hey everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This, a podcast about magic, the occult, the paranormal, the esoteric, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and we have a wonderful show for everybody today. Now, for those that do not know, I have a Patreon, and sometimes up on this Patreon, I will put a poll, and it is for the Patreon supporters to vote for what topics will get covered on this podcast. And I just did this last month, and coming up at the very top of this poll was astrological magic. Now, here's the thing. I don't know a ton about astrology, so I needed some help on this one. And truthfully, I got somebody who I have wanted to have on the show for a very long period of time. And we did some talking, and I was able to get him to come on to the show. So I would like to welcome this gentleman who is an astrologer, an artist, a designer, a writer, a speaking coach, a magician, a poet, and a philosopher based out of Western Massachusetts. I will use the term, he is a Renaissance man, former teacher, former fencing coach, current Toastmaster, and astrologaster extraordinaire. Welcome to What Magic Is This, Andrew Watt. Andrew, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. That was a nice introduction. Thank you.
I try my best. So, Andrew, before we get rolling here, because what was voted on in this poll was astrological magic, or as I will kind of go back and forth calling it astral magic. Sometimes I'll say astral magic. Sometimes I'll straight astrological magic, just back and forth. But I have to ask you a personal question, Andrew. But how did you get started in astrology, and why is astrology important to you to this day?
I got started in astrology because I kept running up against astrology in other forms of magical study. Okay. There was a point, I think it was probably around 2012 or 2013, so a decade ago now, when I was working through some Golden Dawn material and realized, okay, I'm going to have to tackle at least the basics of understanding planets, signs, houses, aspects. I'm going to have to get enough of that under my belt that I understand what all these other subjects are doing. So I worked through a book by a guy by the name of Damien Sharp, which I think is just called Learning Astrology. And that was sort of my first introduction to it. I think it's a valuable book for beginners because it doesn't assume that you need to know an enormous amount of math. It doesn't assume that you need to know an enormous amount of astrology's history. It just says, here's what all the planets mean, here's what all the signs mean, here's what the aspects mean. And it gives you a starting point to enter. It doesn't really explain how you go about taking that information and interpreting it. And it turns out that there's no way to learn that except to do it a lot and make guesses and then see whether your guesses are right or wrong. And it took me 10 years, not 10 years, maybe 6 years to feel like I had enough of a handle on it that it was critical to my profession. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that I did Rufus Opus's Seven Spheres course, which at the time was called Head for the Red and came out through his blog. And one of the things that you did in that was you summoned the four elements of the angels, or conjured them and communicated with them. And then you did that for the seven planets using the Thomas Taylor translations of the Orphic hymns. And you can't do that work on a regular basis without forming some kind of connection with the planets. And there came a point in 2016 or 2017 where the work that I had done with planetary intelligences just sort of said, yeah, you're an astrologer now, learn. And I did in very short order. In the space of 2018 maybe to 2020, I went from sort of treating it as this very casual part of my practice to genuinely feeling like this was the thing that I was being called to do. And thanks to astrology, I know that I'm going to be doing it for at least another decade. And that somewhere in the neighborhood of a decade to a decade and a half from now, my practice is probably going to come to an end and I'll have to do something else. But for now, this is what I'm doing.
I have to say, though, Andrew, because before we started recording this episode, and about the 2.5 hours before hitting the record button, I had an insane amount of imposter syndrome surge through my body and my brain because I looked through my Discord server, and you're a patron, and so thank you very much. You talk with other people who are fairly versed in astrology on that. What you and the others are talking about there is insane. So your knowledge is as far as like specific knowledge of astrology is less than a decade old, you say, and yet you learned so much in that time.
There's a couple of different pieces to this, which I think are relevant to the idea of astral magic or astrological magic.
Okay.
Which is that astrological magic assumes as a starting point that the fixed stars of the eighth sphere, that the seven planets, the visible planets, and now, of course, we've also got what I call the upstarts or the interlopers, the outer planets, are living beings. They are living and they are intelligent. And that if you begin to have a relationship with them, they will have a relationship with you. Period. We have lots of people that are in your Patreon and mine who have relationships with gods, who think of themselves as the priests and priestesses of spirits and gods and divinities. And we treat their practice respectfully. Maybe we feel like their approach to a specific god or deity is not how we would approach it, but we're not in that relationship.
Right.
Rufus Opus and his course said, look, here's how you call up these spirits, and this is how you begin to have a relationship with them. And I was in relationship with them for 5 or 6 years. And then all of a sudden, I had a friend of a friend basically give me a stack of astrology books that was about 1.5 feet high, and people that were my people not in my tarot class, but people I had done tarot or geomancy readings for were like, do you know anything about astrology? And it was kind of like getting hit over the head over and over and over again. You really have to do this.
Right.
You are called to this task and to this methodology right here, right now, and we will speed you through the process. I mean, I hung out my shingle as a pro astrologer, and I had more readings than I could handle for the first month. And that first year that I was in business, I had started a consulting business in 2016, 2017. And I'd struggled at that for 2016 through 2020. And then the pandemic hit and I hung out my shingle in a much more professional way. I made more money in those first 12 months in the pandemic as an astrologer than in the previous 4 years of a mundane career as a private professional consultant. I mean, right. That's how solid it was. We need you to do this. You're said the spirit world, we'll find you the clients to make you this worth your while. And they did.
Nice.
My schedule was full, and my mundane, or my regular world, my real world, not real world, what's the right word for this? My non-occult world literally collapsed. There was enough from this other source to sustain. And that kind of is the nature of astrological magic, is that if you're called to it, it will show up and you will learn it, and it will happen in a hurry. And I look at my chart and I look at sort of the next decade or so, and I can see that there is a window when I will not be called to do this work anymore. And I expect that the doors will shut with as much force as they opened. So if you want a reading with me, you've got about a decade.
Everybody, right? We'll get it. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. In fact, I didn't, but Andrew's got a wonderful blog called Wandering in the Labyrinth, where he puts up horoscopes every decan, and we will get into the decans a little bit later on. But Andrew is, I'm just going to say this. I love a lot of astrologers. There's only a few that I listen to. Andrew is one of them. And Andrew, I find he's very poetic. Andrew is also a poet, which I did mention. Andrew's very poetic. He brings up a lot of Greek references, which I always enjoy, but it is fantastic. So I will say, anybody who needs some astrology help, Andrew is somebody to go to. And many people within my Discord server and my Patreon, they have been helped by Andrew. I just will say this. I have to ask you, though, Andrew, because everyone you ask this question to will get a different answer. But what is astrological or astral magic to you specifically?
I think that that's a good place to begin. And it starts with what was, for a while, my stepdaughter's favorite joke. What's the difference between a good joke and a bad joke timing? What's the difference between a good joke and a bad joke timing? She loved telling it both ways. And that's kind of the essence of it, right? That astrological magic assumes, with Ecclesiastes, that there's a time for everything, that there is an appropriate time to do each and everything. There's a lot of different theories about this. Some say that the planets are like a clock, and when the hands of the clock, the planets, are pointing to a specific time, then it's the right time to do this. And when they're not pointing to that time, it's not the right time. Other people say that the planets themselves are causing these things to happen in our lives.
Right.
I tend to go with Marsilio Ficino, a Renaissance scholar and later a Catholic priest, and sort of one of the first people who was trying to recover Hellenistic era and Roman era thought in the Renaissance. And he was of the opinion that the planets are neither a clock, nor are they forces that cause these changes in our lives. Rather, that there are invisible waves moving through the cosmos, which are the actions of God. And those waves cause all of us to experience certain things at certain times. And the planets, being so much larger than we are, ride on those waves in observable ways that allow us to deduce what's likely to happen. I really like that. I don't know whether there's God or gods, but I think there is that underlying idea that the planets are these vast and intelligent beings that nonetheless are subject to invisible forces that we can't see, and they're riding on the same waves that we are. I like that model of it a great deal, because it suggests that the universe is far vaster and stranger than we can possibly imagine. We're riding the wave just like everything else in the cosmos. As above, so below, right?
Absolutely. We will talk a little bit about Ficino a bit down the road here, but I have to ask you, Andrew, astrology and magic, have they always been intertwined to some extent?
I think that they have historically. I think that has been less true since the middle of the 1800s. Okay. I think that the period we call the Enlightenment did an enormous amount of damage to the idea that star magic mattered. And I think that part of that was the Gregorian reform. And I think that part of it was the disruption of the calendars that already existed in the Americas, in Africa, in other places in the world, where there was a functional calendar system that got disrupted by European colonialism. Some of those calendars go back thousands of years. Even the Julian calendar, as inaccurate as it was relative to the sun, you throw enough doubt onto calendar systems, and naturally the sky winds up being a little bit disenchanted as a result. I think that part of what we're currently going through with this current astrological revival is the recognition that, yes, magic and religion and spirituality should naturally be tied to the cycles of time that can be observed in the skies.
So let's dive into a bit of history here then. But first, is the history of astrological magic just the same as the history of astrology?
I don't think so.
No. Chinese
astrology, for example, works radically differently than what we might call Mediterranean Indian Ocean astrology or Arabic astrology. And as near as I can tell from limited reading, Mayan astrology and day keeping, day counting, bears no resemblance. And there's very little that I've been able to read about Australian star lore, but again, doesn't fit. So we've got lots of different places in the world that have radically different sets of star lore, and there are little bits and pieces of overlap, like Orion seems to be a hunter in a lot of different cultural traditions, and maybe that's as old as 25 or 30,000 years. But the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper are bears in Northern European cosmology, and they are Indian or Native American warriors trudging across the sky in other traditions. In African American slave mythology, they are drinking gourds. And in a lot of other cultures, they're in Anglo-Saxon England, it was the wagon of Wayland the Smith, I think it is. Mm-hmm. So we have lots of different overlapping stories about the sky. And the one that's currently powerful, the one that we keep writing all these books about or translating ancient sources from, is the Greco-Roman Mediterranean astrology, and now to some degree Indian or Jyotisha astrology. But they're not exclusive. And I think that we have to remember that we have to be cautious about privileging the written word too much. I mean, I have to be honest, Western astrology is largely bibliomancy. Most of us are not going out into the night and doing direct sky observations. We're reading books, and then based on the books, applying very complicated rules to a chart, and we're never looking up at the night sky. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I learned, this is now 4 or 5 years ago, is I happened to go out one night and I realized that the ecliptic, the line that the sun travels, passes directly through the position where you would find, quote unquote, the head of the constellation Orion. And that meant that all of the planets at some point would be at tropical 22, 23, 24 degrees of Gemini, which is slightly different in sidereal astrology and slightly different in azimuth and right ascension as it's calculated by modern astronomers. But it's still, the sun is on the constellation of Orion just about 3 days before the summer solstice.
Okay.
Now, like in our time, that's true.
Right.
But if you go back 2,000 years, it's not true. If you go back 24,000 years, it's possibly true, but we weren't there to observe it. If you go back 10,000 years, it was at the winter solstice, right? Because we have this thing called precession of the equinoxes. So sky lore connects us to how our planet has changed over time, deep into the past and potentially deep into the future. But in a sense, we're only the navigators that are assigned to watch during this particular season. My dad was an airplane pilot, first for the US Navy, transporting goods across the Pacific during the early years of the Vietnam War. Hercules C-130s, that sort of thing.
Wow. Yeah.
And he tells the story of coming onto deck halfway through this 14 or 15-hour flight, 2 navigators assigned to each shift. And he comes out onto the flight deck and he says to the navigator, "I relieve you." And the navigator on duty says, "I'm relieved. You're in command. You're in charge now." And Dad says, "Can you identify our position?" And the other navigator says, "I have no fucking clue." They're in the middle of the Pacific. There is nowhere to go, right?
Yeah.
The only piece of land is an island that is not much bigger than the dining room that I'm currently calling you from. And you don't know where you are. Dad wound up having to call the captain of the plane in the cockpit and say, "You have to take the plane up to 10,000 feet. This is in the 60s before the cabins are fully pressurized.
Right.
And I need to make direct star observations so that I can find out where we are and we don't run out of fuel." I mean, that's fucking magic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you think, okay, the Polynesians were doing this on the surface of the water 10,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and they had to build the entire intellectual apparatus of what was happening. And Dad walked into a flight school in San Diego and learned celestial navigation in 6 weeks using a whole bunch of tools that previously existed, as opposed to having to build everything from scratch. So that's the kind of intellectual tradition that we're coming out of, that astrology has gone to a sheet of paper or a computer screen where all of the calculations are done in advance, and we're just doing a lot of interpretation of a set of information that's previously presented. You look back into some of the Arabic astrologers and you realize, okay, these guys are doing celestial navigation and interpretation simultaneously in their heads while talking to a client. I stand on the shoulders of giants, mathematically, intellectually, and magically, and there's no way that I can replicate what they can do. And I've got a 10-year career in astrology ahead of me, and I'm like, I'm going to use computers for as long as I can, and then I'm going to give up.
I have to ask, Andrew, what is the history of this, of combining astrology with doing ritual? What do you see as the history of this this tradition? It is a 10-year tradition. There's just the observation, but there's also taking that information for helping other people, helping. A lot of times it was used for rituals for royalty or aristocrats. What is the history of astral magic as you understand it?
I think that there are pieces in Picatrix, which is this 9th century grimoire of astrological magic, that are probably coming out of Egyptian, Middle Eastern, and Mesopotamian magical traditions. And what we're seeing there is you're looking for an occasion when the moon is hiding a star. It's called occultation, from which we get the word occult, right? The moon is in a position where either its glow or its body is blocking a star, or the star is in such a position that it is grazing the side of the moon. So you can sort of see the star poking out from behind the moon. And the moon is sort of understood to be a vessel which is gathering that light from distant stars or from distant planets and projecting this energy down to Earth or the living being, or it's providing a transporter or a wormhole or a stargate for that intelligence to reach Earth and make some kind of a transformation. I have seen moments like this. There was, in fact, I think it was just yesterday, and unfortunately we had clouds, but there was a moment where Jupiter was hidden behind the moon, and then about an hour later was supposed to come out from behind the moon. And if you had a really good telescope or even a pair of binoculars, you would have been able to see it happen, and it would have taken about an hour. Your viewers aren't going to be able to see this, but maybe we can find a link for the show notes.
Sure.
But your pinky held at arm's length is about a degree wide. So you can sort of imagine somebody on a ziggurat or on a half-finished pyramid in Egypt standing there and very gently dividing the sky up into 360 pinkies. It takes about 4 minutes for a fixed star to move from the left side of your pinky to the right side of your pinky. So that gives you a rough sense of how fast the stars are moving at night. That if you could stand there and keep your finger completely still for 4 minutes, you would be able to get a sense of how fast that quote unquote sphere of the fixed stars is moving. Now, I always get this a little bit wrong, but the 3 fingers, like you're giving the Boy Scout sign with your thumb holding down your pinky. So your forefinger, middle finger, and ring finger together. I think that's about 10 degrees, might be 5. And then your fist, I guess your 3 fingers, like the Boy Scout salute, 3-fingered salute, is 5 degrees. And then your whole fist is about 10 degrees. And then if you put up your forefinger and your pinky finger, that's about 15 degrees. And if you spread your thumb and pinky in a hang 10, that's about 25 degrees.
Okay.
So it's possible to do astrology just with literally rules of thumb. You can use your hand to measure the sky. And a lot of astrology is based on those kinds of measurements, right? 25 degrees plus a little bit more is 30 degrees. That's a sign. That's one sign of the zodiac. You can measure that almost with your hand. And you can say, oh, it's a little bit wider than that. That's probably a sign. Oh, those 2 planets are not in the same sign. They're in different signs. They're separated. And you begin to get a sense of how to measure the sky and get a sense of where individual planets are. So then you have guys up on top of ziggurats or on top of pyramids or out in the desert in Egypt or in Jordan, and they're measuring this stuff a little bit at a time and making long distance estimates. And then somewhere around 3000 BC, maybe 4000 BC, they figured out that there were a bunch of these things that were repeatable and had repeating processes that were easy enough that you could record them and that they would matter for an individual single life. The moon, for example, has 254 lunar cycles, new moon to new moon, in 19 solar years. It's like 19.01894. It's not exact, but it's off by hours instead of by weeks. So now you can take units of 19 years and compare them, and then you discover that eclipses repeat roughly every 54 years.
Right.
And now you're in a position to say, okay, I don't know if an eclipse is going to happen here, if it's going to happen here, but I know that this is a window of time in which an eclipse could occur. And we can hold ceremonies to prevent the eclipse from happening, or we can hold ceremonies to try to encourage the eclipse to happen if that's what we think is appropriate. We have places like Stonehenge, which is clearly there to track summer and winter solstices, which also has stones positioned to track summer and winter lunar minimums and maximums. How far south of due east, how far north of due east is it going to rise or set? And are those different in the summer and the winter? Why, yes, they are, which makes that even more complicated. But now we can make some guesses, some educated guesses about whether or not there's going to be an eclipse, whether or not that eclipse is going to be visible where we are standing. And how can we use this to political, economic, or social advantage?
Right. The big question.
And if we acknowledge that we're talking about engaging with living intelligences when we're talking about the planets, then sooner or later, all of these ceremonies and rituals and observations are going to make people have contact experiences with the spirits that they've been engaged in studying and understanding. And because we tend to have spiritual experiences with non-human intelligences in the language in which we have learned to relate to them, those contact experiences are going to take the form of mathematics, geometry, and ecstatic experience. I don't know if you've ever done any geometry for the purposes of having ecstatic experiences, but the first time that I drew a pentagram,
okay,
by doing a geometric proof, I laughed for about 20 minutes straight because it's so counterintuitive. It shouldn't work. Like, there's things about it. You're just drawing circles and drawing straight lines. And then suddenly it can't be anything other than a pentagon or a pentagram. And you go, oh my God. And it works for circles of any size. Right. It will always work. You don't have to measure it. You don't have to get out your protractor. You don't have to, it's just there. And then after a while, you suddenly realize, oh my God, Venus does the same thing every 13 years. And suddenly you're having ecstatic experiences over math.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this whole custom and culture in West Africa, for example, where music in 2s and 3s and 5s and drum rhythms leads to ecstatic dance and to ecstatic experiences. There's no reason to assume that there isn't the same thing happening at the foot of the ziggurat of Inanna. Like, we are having highly emotional spiritual experiences by doing elaborate, mathematically, geometrically plotted dances in front of the temple to the moon goddess or to the evening star. Oh, thank goodness. Venus has come out of the sky, and we no longer see the evening star Irish Kigal. We see the morning star Inanna. I cannot imagine what it was like for Mesopotamian priests and early astronomers to realize after however many decades that the evening star Irish Kigal and the morning star Inanna were the same thing.
The same star.
There's this book by Neil Stephenson, The Baroque Cycle, and one of his characters in that is a fictional Renaissance Enlightenment era scientist named Waterhouse. And he gets a list from a spy of his of the things that Isaac Newton is asking about and trying to deduce what it is that Isaac Newton has worked out. And Isaac Newton has asked for the ephemeris data for a comet from a previous year, an earlier year, and in fact, a whole series of comets. And this Dr. Waterhouse character suddenly deduces in the middle of this calculation that they're not two different comets, one going one direction and the other going in the other, that Isaac Newton has already realized that they're the same comet going in one direction, but it happens to be a circle of some kind.
Right.
Those are the kinds of magical experiences that early astronomers are having and then translating into ceremony and magical experiences, both for themselves and others. So I think that there's a huge percentage of not only magic, but spirituality in the heart of these experiences. And it's part of the reason why I turned so much of moments in astrology into poetry, because whether it's 30 years from now or 3 months from now or 3,000 years from now, those moments will come again, and maybe they'll find some use for my poem. It's kind of an immortality spell, right?
I got it. Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up a lot of, from Mesopotamia, a lot of what you do as far as decans are concerned, and we will cover decans, but that's mainly an old Egyptian concept that is used. Egypt seemed to be a pretty interesting place as far as it's long tenured, obviously, well over 2,000 years of dynasties, but also after Hellenization, after Alexander the Great, and after the founding of Alexandria, and we all know about the library at Alexandria. What you have is the mixing of Babylonian astrology with Egyptian decanic astrology. You have things like the Greek magical papyri, in which there's very obvious elements of astrological timings along with when to do certain rituals. What else do we have from this period of time? You brought up something rather interesting, actually, before we started recording. There's other ways of understanding how magic and astrology played a part in these people's lives.
I think Gordon White talked about this at one point, and he pointed out that 146 BC is this year that the Mediterranean largely gets united by Rome, and the Middle East and all the way to Asia had sort of been united by Alexander the Great and his armies roughly 200 years before, or 100 years, century and a half before that.
Right.
Doing well my numbers. I'm doing this.
323 was the death of Alexander, right? So yeah, we're looking at that.
23, and then you're taking, so it's about 150-ish years.
Yeah.
And all of the different cultures and societies basically are in this position where they have to sit down and they have to talk with one another for the first time and say, okay, here's the magic that we've got. What have you got?
Right.
And Alexandria is the place where all of that happens, because that's where, if you pull into the port, they search your ship for books and they take and copy all of them. And then they give you the copies back rather than the originals.
Right. I love it.
And so some cultures say, well, we're not going to write anything down. That was the Druidic philosophy, is you have to memorize all of this and you have to be a living book. And other cultures are like, oh, yeah, well, here's all of our techniques and here's all of our tools. And people are researching that. I think that one of the things that comes out of that in the 300s is Hipparchus of Rhodes designs right ascension and azimuth. We know that there's this thing called precession of the equinoxes. We can see that the moment that spring begins relative to the fixed stars is changing roughly 1 degree every 72 years. We know that this thing is happening. We need a way of tracking it. He devises the basics of this mathematical coordinate system for the heavens, which astronomers are basically using today. There have been some refinements in the system, but the system of right ascension azimuth is how my dad in the 1960s learned to do celestial navigation. And now that gets done by computers and satellites. If you wanted to know where you were, you had to use that methodology. It is incredibly intense to try to do that if you've got tools to build this. My dad had an analog laptop computer that's strapped to his leg in the flight deck of this Hercules 130. And it was sort of like a circular analog calculator. You sort of twisted dials and lined up things, and it did three-dimensional 360-degree calculations to help you figure out where you were.
Right.
Sort of a slide rule that's strapped to your leg, a circular slide rule, right? Bizarre thing. He sold it a few years ago. I always sort of wondered what happened to it, and I found out that he sold it. But you've got other things like the Antikythera mechanism coming out of the oceans. So there's at least one ship that has a machine on board for simplifying these calculations to the point where you can say, okay, the Olympic Games are going to start on a Thursday 13 years from now.
Right. People that don't know what you're talking about, it was this incredible device. A lot of people call it like an out of place artifact, but that's not giving enough credit to these cultures that really live their lives astrologically. There will be a link in the show notes. We can go into it a little bit here, but it's such a fascinating artifact. It's one of the most amazing artifacts we have ever found from the ancient world. But yeah, what was it used for?
We don't know, right? Because all we have is the remnants of the artifact, which was broken when we found it.
Right.
In a shipwreck, 1923, something like that, off the coast of an island in Greece. But it runs on a 19 to 254 cycle, which means that this machine would have jammed. It would have sort of locked up pretty easily. But one of the ways that 19 to 254 is very rare. And the only thing that anybody has ever figured out that it could possibly be is the relationship of solar years to lunar months. It's operating on a set of assumptions that that 19 year to 254 month calendar matters. And it's trying to create some kind of a model of how the cosmos works mechanically. It's an analog planetarium, if you will, to make predictions about where you're going to find the planets 13 months from now or 13 years from now. There's that. They're not only conceptually identifying how the planets are moving by the 3rd century BC, but they're also able to integrate with that important social events in their own calendar. The Olympic Games, the Heron Games, the other 2 minor sequences of athletic competition, major festivals in the calendar of the Mediterranean, feasts for the gods. There's a temple in Agrigento, which is in Sicily, on the southern coast of Sicily. It's in ruins now. And it was a temple to Apollo, the sun god. We're used to thinking of temples as just being roofed dark chambers.
Right.
And this one is designed very differently. The roof appears to have been a false roof that hid the fact that there was a gigantic open to the sky courtyard in the interior of the building. So you would go in through the front doors, you would pass into complete darkness. You'd go through the doors on the other side of the vestibule, and you would emerge into a courtyard open to the sky with a statue to Apollo covered in gold leaf, so that it would be brilliantly gold in the sunshine and blindingly so.
Right.
So they're figuring out ways of transforming personal experience through these kinds of mechanical things. But the experience is still astral or astrological. We want you to have an experience that allows you to see the golden personification of the sun as a human being or a human form here in this temple. And we're going to take raw sunlight, channel it into this courtyard. You're going to walk through complete darkness, and you're going to experience this moment of golden brilliance and come to understand the sun on a very personal level. So there's that. There's the Antikythera mechanism. There's, as you pointed out, the Greek papyri, the Greek magical papyri, usually abbreviated PGM, papyri Graeci Magici, something like that. And all of these things are sort of being pulled together in a variety of ways. And I think that astrology provides a kind of organizing principle for them.
Okay.
It's not necessarily that it's the only possibility, but they've already got enough gods associated with the 7 planets that they can take Egyptian and Mesopotamian and Iberian and Celto-Romanic and Germanic things and sort of unify them under this basic principle that there are these 7 stars in the sky that wander, and we can divinize them, and anybody can plug into that system relatively easily. And oh, by the way, you can worship the emperor at the same time. It doesn't really matter whether it's the Roman emperor or the Egyptian pharaoh or the Greek man or woman who has taken the place of the Egyptian pharaoh. They're all sort of the same thing, and they're all capable of sort of being worshipped as the son of the sun.
I'm going to bring up a concept a little bit before or after this question, but what does the later Mediterranean after this point, we'll use the term Mesopotamian, what is going on with Arabic astrology and particularly like another group called the Sabians or the Sabians of Haran? What is going on there? Because as far as mystical groups are concerned, and everybody who loves magic and the occult like you do, like I do, the Sabians of Haran are like the most mysterious. For me, it's like, what is going on here? They seem so fascinating, and we know absolutely nothing. But what do you think is happening in this area with Arabic astrology and all of this interesting part before we start to head over to Europe?
Yeah, so the more Christianized that the Roman Empire gets, and I don't necessarily mean this as a dig on modern Christians, but the fight between ancient Christians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD and the survivals of paganism are ugly.
Yeah.
Like, Christians are getting rounded up and they're being put on display in coliseums and amphitheaters and fed to the lions. On the one hand, that's really ugly. And on the other hand, the way in which they are dying unafraid of death is really impressive to a lot of pagans who are feeling like the nature of the spiritual experiences that they're having in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century AD Rome is really broken.
Yeah.
I think it's Robin Lane Fox writes about this in a book called Pagans and Christians. And that book is probably 20 or 25 years old, maybe older than that.
Still amazing.
It's still an amazing book.
Yeah.
But on the Christian side, Christian martyrs are dying completely unafraid of death. And that was the thing that had always been the selling point of the mysteries of Eleusis. That if you went through the lesser and the greater mysteries of Eleusis, you would come out of those experiences not being able to talk about them or explain them, but unafraid of death. And we know that some of the later or last initiates were starting to not have that experience, right? They're not willing to talk about what their experience is, so we still don't know what it is because they're still upholding their oath. But the experience that they are having is not keeping them unafraid of death. And meanwhile, the Christians are coming out of their secret mysteries, the Eucharist or the Mass or the celebration of the bread and wine in the 2nd and 3rd centuries was open only to the baptized and was a hidden rite. It was a mystery. And the words that we have about ite profani, go away, that comes out of the Eucharistic tradition of Christianity. You can't be here, go away until after you've been baptized.
Right.
So for Christians to come out of those ritual experiences unafraid of death is a real challenge to the paganism of the era. And I think that modern pagans do a real disservice by saying that it was all violence. On the other hand, Christian mobs are wandering around Alexandria in the 3rd century AD, and they're performing enormous violence against both pagans and Jewish communities in Alexandria and elsewhere in the Roman Empire. And lots of people begin to feel like the intellectual environment of the Roman Empire is not safe. And a huge number of these people go over the border into the Parthian Empire, right? So the Platonists are fleeing Alexandria and Athens and other cities, and they're going to places like Haran, which is a backwater, but it's relatively close to the border. It's in modern-day Syria, I think, or maybe North Iraq. So they get the benefits of knowing what's going on in the Roman Empire, and maybe they can return someday, and they're not so deep into the Parthian Empire that they're going to attract official notice from the Parthian emperors and maybe, grabbed and milked for secrets or tortured for being Roman citizens in the wrong country. And they set up schools and they continue to teach, and they're in a position of relative safety. And it turns out that they know stuff. They know stuff about medicine. They know stuff about mathematics. They know how to calculate the positions of the planets. They have all sorts of architectural and engineering knowledge. And the Parthian kings are like, we don't want to torture you. We want you to work for us. So we start seeing the Parthians making use of the kinds of technologies and information that come with these esoteric spiritual practitioners that are coming out of what we might call high-end intellectual paganism. And the Sabians of Haran become their own planetary cult. We're going to have temples to each of the 7 visible planets. We have shrines to some of the minor, or we have shrines to at least some of the major fixed stars like Sirius and Betelgeuse and maybe the Pole Star. And then the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire more or less collapse in the face of Islam and the worship of one God and only one God. But there's a loophole that if you are a society, if you are a culture, a people of the book, if you worship the one God and you have a book and you believe in prophets, not prophets in the marketplace, but prophets delivering messages from God, you get the ability to be taxed by the new Islamic regime, but you don't get persecuted or killed. So you have to pay a special tax. And the tax applies differently to Jews and to Christians, and you don't have to pay it if you convert. But the Sabians of Haran apparently do some research after being threatened with death by the Sultan, and they say, oh, yeah, we're people of the book. Here is our book. Our chief prophet, the prophet that we follow, is Hermes Trismegistus. Here are our sacred texts. And we worship the one God through the movements of the planets, which are merely our timing mechanism for worshiping the one God. They got saved for at least a couple hundred years by towing that party line from the takeover of the Middle East by Dar al-Islam. And they may have survived into the 1000s or even the 1100s. We don't really know when it all comes crashing down.
Yeah.
Now, on the European side, a huge body of knowledge of how the stars move just collapses. And we don't know how deep that hole goes. But we do know that people like the Venerable Bede, who was a scholar and priest of the Catholic Church operating in the northern part of England, has to basically work out a methodology for calculating the date of Easter through arithmetic. They're not doing planetary observations. They're doing it with just ordinary math. And in about 900 AD, a little bit before that, we get a guy by the name of Gerbert of Auxerre. He goes on a diplomatic mission. He's a monk in the south of France and near the Pyrenees. He gets attached to some kind of a diplomatic mission to the Caliphate in Cordoba in Spain, goes down into Spain. He's apparently a mathematical whiz. They teach him a bunch of math. He comes back over the Pyrenees at the end of his diplomatic mission with a bunch of other people and gets hired in the court of Charlemagne's successors to open cathedral schools to teach the new math. And the new math is here's how we do math with Arabic numerals and place notation instead of with Roman abacuses and Roman numerals. And that triggers the new plan to observe the heavens and start collecting astrological and astronomical data again. And it triggers a massive translation project. But there's this period from about 400 AD until about 1000 AD when we can see that things collapse to a very low level, and then they're gradually rebuilding astronomical and astrological knowledge, largely by importing it from Spain and by making the transition from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals.
Extremely fascinating period. For a lot of people that don't understand, when Andrew's talking about Spain at this period of time was mainly Islamic. So that's where the Arabic numerals, they come through here, and also a lot of Arabic astral magic as well. Let's bring up a term here, because this seems like a good place, because we're an hour in and we have nary touched the magical side of this. But Andrew, what is image magic? Some people will also say Arabic image magic, but what is image magic to you?
Okay, so one of the things that may have come back from Spain with Gerbert of Auxerre is probably the first Latin translation of Picatrix, which in Arabic is called Gayat al-Hakim, the aim of the wise. I have only just been able to get my hands on a copy relatively recently of an Arabic translation of Gayat al-Hakim, so I'm only just beginning to be able to compare them.
Okay.
But among the chapters in Picatrix, and I'm not going to be able to cite the chapters because, as Douglas, but your listeners are about to find out, I am not at home and the library is not within easy reach. There's like a bookshelf with all these things here. I can't even look at it. It's so frustrating. There is a whole chapter on how to brew paints. Now, I don't brew those paints. I go and I buy paint pens, or I just use ink pens. I'm a big fan of a brand called Steitler. They're German, and they make this really nice 3-sided pen called a fine liner, which is 0.3 millimeters or something like that. They're lovely.
Okay.
Those for astrological magic. But there's a whole chapter on how to make paint.
Okay.
And there is also a whole series of chapters about these are the divisions of the moon cycle. We're going to call them mansions of the moon. And there are a bunch of standardized images for each of the 28 mansions. And these are the decans. These are the three subdivisions of each zodiac sign. And these are the images that are associated with those 36 subdivisions of the zodiac signs. And here are the 7 planets, and here are the images that are associated with them. Like Jupiter is a man on a throne, which is in a chariot that's being carried by eagles and is surrounded by 4 women with wings. Like that. I think that's one of the ones from the chapter on Jupiter.
Okay.
And the 7th mansion of the moon is a man on his knees praying with his hands uplifted. And the 3rd mansion is a woman seated on the ground, cross-legged, with one hand in the air over her head. So every culture has forbidden activities. Islam's forbidden activities is making pictures. You can draw flowers, you can draw trees, you can draw birds, you can sort of draw animals. That starts getting iffy. But people is really right out. And people is really right out, particularly in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries.
Okay.
By the 12th, 13th century, the Persian court is making these beautiful miniatures with people. Mm-hmm. And what they establish is a bunch of conventions whereby you never show Muhammad's face. He's always wearing a veil, or you simply leave blank canvas.
Right.
right? Because that's how you know that it's Muhammad, because it's not a picture of him. It's just the figure.
Right.
But they realize that they need pictures. Well, Picatrix is an entire course in the forbidden science of drawing at pictures. Here's how you make the paints. Here are the standard images that you should paint when the moon is between this degree and that degree. Here is the standard picture that you should learn how to paint when the sun is between this degree and that degree, or when this planet is in this position. This is the picture that you draw in order to create an icon to worship this planet or engage this planet in magical activity. Oh. So that's how most of this magic works, that you draw the picture, you finish the picture at the moment that the planet reaches the correct degree or moment in time. You consecrate that picture, and then it's done. And then the picture does the magic for you. The picture is the spell. So if you want all good things, you wait until the moon is in the third mansion, which is associated with the Pleiades, the star group on the back of the constellation Taurus. You draw the picture of the woman seated cross-legged with her right hand in the air over her head, and that woman is drawing all of the good things down for you, rather than you having to sit there for hours and hours and do a petition and maybe being discovered by the Christian priests or the Jewish rabbis or the Muslim imams or any form of secret police, and they will do the work for you. But the first challenge that you have to get over is that you have been told and brought up all your life to believe that pictures of people are evil and wrong. Oh. This is taboo breaking magic, and it works really, really well. So a lot of magic in Picatrix works that way. There's a lot of other magic which is alchemical. And if you do not know what you are doing, you should not do that, because some of those recipes generate poisons.
Right.
Clouds of poison. Oh, look, the spell for eternal life generates a death-dealing poison. Maybe you shouldn't use that one. And the same goes for the paint recipes. Some of those are made with toxic ingredients like white lead. That's not a thing you should be playing around with if you don't know what you're doing. But on the other hand, just using white or using the color recommendations that this sign or planet is yellow and this one is green and this one is blue, that's fine. It works fine.
Andrew, I have to ask you, because this is very different. This image magic is very, very different than, say, something like Solomonic evocation. Is there a way of explaining it for folks? Because this was big. Like, people don't understand that there were people in Europe, including Albertus Magnus, one of the most famous figures within early, medieval Christian theology, that talked about specific use of astrological images. So this was big. So what is it about these images, and also this other aspect of them, which are talismans, which we will talk about a little bit later on, as opposed to something, say, like the hygromantia, or trying to call up a ton of spirits one-on-one. So what is the difference between these two kinds of magic? Because they were both fairly popular.
Yeah, they are both fairly popular. I'm not sure that I'm the right person to talk about this in an academic sense, but let me see if I can try to talk about it from a practitioner's point of view.
Please.
I have done the Seven Spheres work, and in the Seven Spheres Rufus Opus working, he's using what's frequently called the Trithemian operation, or the art of drawing spirits into crystals. You have a table of practice, usually a round disc. You've got some kind of a stick coming out of that round disc. You've got a bunch of stuff drawn on the disc. You've got a crystal on top of the disc. you've got a couple of candles, or maybe you've only got one, you've got some incense burning. Then you do some kind of an invocation to create a circle of protection around yourself. And you do another circle to protect you from whatever spirit gets called into the crystal. So you've got sort of a donut of protection.
Right.
And then you summon a spirit into the crystal. It is a whole lot of language. It is a whole lot of movement. It is a whole lot of gesturing with a wand. It is a whole bunch of shouting at rocks.
Yes.
and that method works. Right? That if you want to talk to spirits, that method absolutely works. You wait for the right hour for it to be the hour of the sun or the hour of the moon, and then you do a bunch of walking around in circles and gesturing at a crystal on an altar and lighting candles and smelling a bunch of incense, and you will absolutely have an experience of having this spirit looking out at you through the crystal. And even if you don't have the experience of seeing the spirit in the crystal, you had better behave as though there were a spirit in that crystal, and not simply throw up your hands and forget to properly dismiss that spirit and then take down your wards and protections, do the ceremonial. Because if you don't do those procedures in the right order, you will be haunted and you will be obsessed with the idea, oh my God, did I really dismiss that spirit properly? Or have I really fucked up here? And then,
right.
Is my life being ruined by the spirit? And is the bad stuff that happened to me this week really my own incompetence or my own mediocrity, or are the forces of the universe out to get me for disrespecting them?
Right.
Like, that's a terrible position to be in.
Absolutely.
I hope your listeners...
I've done it. I've been there, Andrew. I've been there.
I hope your listeners get the point that both of us have fucked up in exactly this way, right?
Yeah.
And in these sessions that I was doing, one of the things that came to me out of this was that I should wear a tie in the color of the planetary day.
Interesting.
There's this whole period in the early 2000s through to the late 2010s where I can look at a picture and I can see, they can say, oh, do you know when this picture was taken? And I can say, well, it was taken on a Tuesday. Wearing a red tie in honor of...
Right.
I may not be able to tell you the exact year, but I can tell you that it was a Tuesday, or I can tell you that it was a Sunday.
Right.
And I fucked up. I can even remember that I got home at the end of a very long day, which was at the end of a whole long series of days. And I went to take off my tie and I thought, oh shit, this is an orange tie. And today is not Wednesday. And a whole lot of things tumbled out of that experience. And that's part of the reason why I'm an astrologer today. It's also why I don't wear ties anymore, because if you have enough hard days in a row, you will forget what tie you're supposed to be wearing today.
Right.
But we've had this experience. Image magic is different. Right? It is not as dependent on your ability to be confident in ritual space. The ritual can be very simple, right? You're watching the clock. You've already worked out all these bunches of astrological calculations. And when that clock on the wall says this, or when you look out the window and the sun is touching the horizon, it is time. And you have maybe a 5 or 6 minute window to finish a picture that you've maybe been working on for 2 or 3 weeks.
Right.
It's a deadline. And when this deadline arrives, it's done. So I don't know quite how to describe this, but the picture does not have to be good for it to be real. Right? If I'm walking around in my basement or in the apartment where I used to have a temple space, I like that apartment a lot. I sometimes miss it because I had an extra room and it was the temple room. It's always lovely. The new house is lovelier. It's nice to have an actual place of your own, but there's no temple room.
Oh.
Ah, alas, it's better to have a house. It really is.
Okay.
Having a temple room is really nice. Having a house that is yours is nicer.
Right. Okay.
But the skills that you learn from shouting at crystals and the skills that you learn from drawing pictures are radically different.
Yeah.
Right? We were talking earlier about the ecstatic experience of doing math and suddenly realizing, oh, this object in the sky and this object in the sky that we see at different times of the year are actually the same thing. Oh, my God, I understand the universe on a much deeper level. Well, shouting at crystals in ceremony is one way of communicating with the spirit world. Drawing is a different one, and the skills that a spirit can teach you through drawing are different than the skills that you learn by talking to it. So there's a scene in a book by Susan Cooper, who wrote a series called The Dark is Rising, probably in the late 1960s, early 1970s. One of the books is called Green Witch. I think it's the second book in the series.
Okay.
The children in the book keep encountering this nasty man in the town who is always painting, but never painting scenes of the view of the harbor or the roofs or the church spire. His paintings are always sort of ugly, and they've got color slapped on them in weird ways, and they're very abstract, and they don't understand what these paintings mean. And the painter is not very pleasant. And about 2/3 of the way through the book, the Gandalf-like character, whose name is Merriman Lyon, suddenly goes, oh shit, he's painting his spells. And that's kind of what image magic is like for us today. You go into the average occult bookstore, and there are shelves and shelves and shelves of word-based spells. Here's how to draw a sigil. You make your statement of intention, you remove all the doubled letters, you remove all the vowels, you get a bunch of letters, and then you sort of combine those into a squiggle and wave that over a candle and gaze intently at it, and it becomes a spell. Or recite this poem which rhymes and has sort of some vague metrical scheme to it, and that's your spell. Or put 7 rocks and 7 herbs and 7 drops of this and 7 small pieces of incense into this jar, and then fill it up with, I don't know, beef bouillon and bury it in your neighbor's yard, and that will be the curse working.
Right.
Those methods work. Like, at the very least, your neighbor is going to go, why is the dirt dug up? What's under here? Oh, shit. What the fuck is this stupid thing that I've got in my yard? Why the hell is this thing here? And that can be genuinely terrifying all on its own, or it can be powerful, or it can be empowering. But human beings have a very limited number of ways that we can think. In school, we learn reading, we learn writing, we learn arithmetic, and we denigrate drawing. We don't make it possible for you really to study filmmaking except in very high-powered schools for young people or after they get to college.
Right.
But our society runs on image magic.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about this with somebody just the other day about this show, Kunk on Earth, the Phenomena Kunk. And it's this very prim and proper British woman who doesn't know anything and is interviewing all sorts of people about past history. And she gets everything wrong. And all of these experts are completely bewildered. Well, one point of view, this is just a funny TV show. And from another thing, it's the kind of TV show that's designed to make you laugh and disbelieve experts and decide that it's okay to ignore them. Like, what is the message here? Is the message here that we're having fun at the idea that somebody can get money to make a TV show, a documentary history of the world without actually knowing any history of the world?
Right.
Or is it the history of the world doesn't matter and you don't need to know any of it?
Mm-hmm.
TV shows movies. Increasingly, the dialogue is terrible, but the imagery that's created in computer environments that's designed to move bypasses our ability to analyze language. It bypasses our ability to do math and see whether the statistics are being calculated correctly. Images on cave walls in flickering candlelight was some of our first magic ever as a species, and images are still at the heart of what we do. So learning how to draw is a way of insulating yourself against the magic that's being constantly used against you by not very good magicians, except, Marvel movies or Martin Scorsese films, or Ridley Scott, right? Akira Kurosawa. These folks are making movies that are designed to present images that are so viscerally important that you remember them years or decades later as being important to you. And they transform your thinking without you even knowing about it. So you make an image that is specifically magical, that is deliberately then consciously magical. It's going to be working on your consciousness in a very different way than just shouting prescribed lines at a crystal in candlelight.
Right.
That makes
it does. No, it really does. Yeah. I'm trying to remember who it was that made the comparison, but there's this idea that for Muslim Arab magicians, you can't do that kind of conjuration. You can't ring up a demon. That's not good. But what you can do is you can do an image, which is also somewhat transgressive, but that stands for and pulls something specific without it being a specific entity. It pulls those influences without it being absolutely specific. And in a way, it's the difference between fishing with a rod and using a net. Does that make sense?
I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a restaurant near me at the moment where they not only have pictures on the wall of fish, because they have a lot of fish for sale in this restaurant, but inside the frame, there is an example of the lure that is used to catch that particular fish.
Right.
This one has a bead and is adorned with red. This one is black and red and has a flasher. This one has a little piece on it that's designed to imitate iridescent wings. Catching a specific fish, I think, is part of the point of conjuration magic, where you're using text.
Right.
Where you're walking 7 times or 3 times or 5 times around an altar, where you're announcing names to the spirit world and conjuring spirits by name and seal.
Right.
On the other hand, astral magic and image magic is saying the time that is visible in the sky right now has certain opportunities and certain challenges and certain obstacles and certain neutral conditions embedded in it. And I am using this image to capture those potentials in a physical thing down on Earth, which just happens to be a picture. I am of the opinion that you can go to Picatrix and you can go to Heinrich Cornelia Agrippa's 3 books of philosophy, or you can go to Giordano Bruno's book, which is called On the Shadow of the Ideas. Mm-hmm. And there are recipes for these various images. And a lot of these authors do something like, here's the recipe, here's the image. And then a couple of chapters later, it'll say, this is what it is good for. Because if they put both of them together in the same place in the book, they are potentially chargeable with black magic and heresy, and now the person arrested. But if they're in different chapters and they're not right next to one another, then all they're doing is compiling information rather than putting all of the pieces together.
Yeah.
In our notes for today's show, I compared it with hackers who actually know how to code, compared with script kiddies who have a bunch of code that they've downloaded from the internet, and know how to change a few variables, but couldn't write completely original code, right? So there's something similar going on. I can sit down and I can draw a picture. It doesn't have to be a good picture. It can be stick figures, or it can be blocky people, or it can be Lego minifigures on a Lego board. You can assemble these images just about any way that you can possibly imagine.
Mm-hmm.
They'll work. And I realize that sounds weird to say that this just works, but it does. But after you have done enough of the script kiddie versions, here's the text from Giordano Bruno. It says, draw this image. A few chapters later, it says that this is good for having sex. You create the image. You get laid a few times. You do that image a few dozen times, and you begin to think, well, couldn't I have something better than this?
As you do.
Couldn't I do this for prosperity? So you learn how to draw a few more images. One of them is for acquiring customers. One of them is for acquiring merchandise. One of them is for accumulating profit. One of them is to have good friends and allies. And suddenly you've got a business, right? Because you've learned how to work more of these magical image scripts. And then all of a sudden, while making one of these magical image scripts, you think, well, this isn't in any of the books. But what if I were to draw a picture of, instead of a young man writing letters, I was to draw a picture of a young woman writing letters, or a young woman seated with a set of balance beam scales, and the weight is wrong. Like one scale is much higher than the other. And you begin to realize that there are other images which are possible, and that other images which are not in the books are just as capable of being spells for specific moments as images that are in the books. And that's a really scary and exciting moment. The first time that happened to me, I was like, whoa, is this real? How do you decide when that image should be drawn? Like, what era does that go with? Mm-hmm. What time period does that go with? And almost always the answer is the time in which you are currently doing it. The time in which the image occurs to you is the spirit telling you, oh, by the way, when this time rolls around next year, or, if you can hurry, you've got another 20 minutes and you can try doing this extra drawing. So having a sketchbook close at hand is important. And beginning to build a vocabulary of drawings is really important. You don't have to be a good artist. I started with a woman by the name of Sachiko Umoto, who is a children's illustrator from Japan. And she has a bunch of books with titles like, Let's Draw Animals, Let's Draw Happy People, Let's Draw Vehicles. And there's another American artist who does the same thing, whose name is Ed Emberley. And his thing is, let's learn how to draw 25 cars. You can go to the library and take out dozens of books about how to draw and get better in a very short period of time. And every drawing that you do will make you a better artist and a better magician.
Andrew, 500 years, the last 500 years, what?
Oh my God.
What changes have we seen? You mentioned that in the Enlightenment, and since the Enlightenment, astrology took a hit. And therefore, astrological magic also has taken a bit of a hit, because it seems that astrology, from my point of view, I'm really huge into grimoires. Astrology was an adjunct to things like timing. Otherwise, they were correspondence based. It's like it was just that. The astrology was a part of a different ritual. It wasn't the main aspect of the ritual. So the last 500 years, what do you see? And to tack on another part of that, what does astrological magic look like now?
All of those are good questions. Let's start with the way that Europe broke its cosmology, starting with Copernicus and shifting from a geocentric model of the universe to a heliocentric model.
For sure.
Suddenly, all of the planets are going the same direction all the time, and retrogrades don't matter. Retrogrades are an artifact of how Earth moves and how the other planets move relative to Earth, either inside its orbit or outside its orbit, and they have nothing to do with the planets actually moving backwards. I forget whether it's Tycho Brahe or Johannes Kepler who works out specifically. I think it's Tycho Brahe who collects the data.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Kepler who works out that the orbits cannot be circular. They're elliptical. And that breaks the cosmology in another way.
Right.
There's a book that's published in about 1246. It's called De Sphero, On the Sphere.
Okay.
And it's by John de Sacrobosco, I think is the guy's name. It is the only textbook on astronomy. You know how the 7 liberal arts are grammar, logic, rhetoric, and then arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Right.
If you went to university, the astronomy professor would say, read John de Sacrobosco,
Okay.
On the Sphere. And you'd read that, and you'd say, okay, what do I read next? And they'd say, well, nothing. I mean, different universities and different colleges might have 3 or 4 other books for you to read, and then they would give you a test on them. You passed the test, you were certified as being proficient in astronomy. But essentially it was, do you understand how the planets and constellations move, and can you do certain basic calculations like figure out the date of Easter? And a couple of minor things like that. Well, suddenly you need a whole lot more.
Right.
You need Sacrobosco, so you understand everything that was written before Kepler, before Tycho Brahe, before Copernicus. You need to read Copernicus, except nobody did.
No.
The custom in the 15 and 1600s was that you annotated everything that you read, and there are more unannotated copies of Copernicus than there are copies. We have copies that we know belonged to famous people that never opened them. I think the copy of that we know belonged to Galileo didn't even have its pages cut open.
Ew.
That may be a wrong example because I don't have my book with me, but there are things like that people, you would think, oh, that person was absolutely changed by reading about Copernicus. Didn't. Galileo writes The Starry Messenger. And this is a book that, among other things, describes how he turned his telescope on the planet Jupiter and observed that Jupiter had moons.
Moons, yes.
So in the space of 100 to 150 years in the 15, 16, early 1700s, everything that the European world knew about cosmology broke. And everything needed to change. And they didn't know how those things had to change, but they still had all of this translated material on astrology in the libraries. People still learned it. William Lilly writes on Christian astrology. There's a number of other guys, Ramsey and I've forgotten some of my names here, but there's a bunch of guys operating in the 1700s and 1600s that are writing in local vernacular, French in France and English in England, explaining how to do astrology to a vernacular audience rather than a Latin-speaking audience.
Right.
But it doesn't change the fact that the highest levels of the intellectual culture know that they're doing things with the wrong cosmology and what's the new cosmology. That's sort of the state of affairs all the way through the 1700s and into the 1800s. There's a guy by the name of Ebenezer Sibley who is operating at the time of the American Revolution and goes to a lot of trouble to figure out at what point the Declaration of Independence was signed. and creates what's known as the Sibley chart, which, if you're ever interested in doing political astrology, is a great starting.
It is, yes.
But there's sort of this underlying assumption that we're not using the right cosmology, so astrology can't possibly be right. It gets discredited a lot. And then in the early 1900s, somebody realizes, well, we can publish sun sign astrology columns because everybody born in certain windows of time has the same sun sign. And today, like, sun sign astrology is still hugely popular. I was in a store today, this afternoon, and I forget exactly how it came up, but I made a joke about astrology, and this high school student was in the store just sort of hanging out. I wasn't really sure what was going on, and said, "Oh, when's this person's birthday?" And I told them when the birthday was, and they said, "Oh, they're a Gemini." Knew instantly that was during the right window. And I said, "Well, what sun sign are you?" And they told me, and I said, "Oh, well, if you were born on that date, do you know what your rising sign is?" And they said, "Oh, my rising sign is this." And I said, "Oh, so you were born at around 4:30 in the afternoon." And they went, "Wait, what? You can reverse engineer that?" Well, and I said, "Well, yeah, if this is your rising sign, then there has to be this much of an angle between the sun and the rising sign, and that means that you had to have been born sometime within about half an hour of 4:30. Bewildered, but suddenly realizing, oh, there's math involved here, there's angles, and you can do these kinds of calculations simultaneously. The cosmology is broken, but the observations aren't.
Right.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because this is one of those things that can really blow people's minds.
Let's do it.
If you go out into the same field every day for a year and you take observations at the same time, let's say noon, when the sun is at the highest point on its course, it's going to draw a figure 8 in the sky, right? And the farther north or south you are from the equator, the more pronounced that figure 8 is going to become. And it's called the analemma. The analemma is the fact that the sun spends a certain amount of time in the sky at certain latitudes. It reaches its highest zenith at the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere. It reaches the lowest point on its possible course in the northern hemisphere at the winter solstice. And in between, it sort of meanders. And sometimes it's a little bit farther forward, so you get one side of the figure 8. Sometimes it's a little bit farther behind, you get the other side of the figure 8. And the upper loop of the figure 8, which is summertime, tends to be shorter and sort of squatter than the lower part, which is sort of long and elliptical. How do I explain this part? Where am I going with this? You can draw this analemma by doing observations every single day.
Per year.
And you can apply mathematics to that shape. And from that mathematics shape, you will realize with 100% absolute certainty that the sun goes around the earth. The math works out perfectly. And it should be obvious why, right? The sun goes around the earth because the analemma is a perfect shape. Mm. It follows all of the rules. So obviously the sun goes around the earth rather than the earth around the sun, because we don't experience any motion, and we can observe the sun's motion with the most reliable set of tools, our eyes. Our eyes see the sun going around the earth, and we can track it, and it creates perfect shapes in the sky. When we track it moving, it moves. So then you think, well, I should apply that same kind of logic to the next most obvious object in the sky, which is the moon. So you apply the same kind of logic to the moon, and it takes you 54 years before you can plot out all of the eclipses. It takes you 19 years before you know that, oh yeah, it moves because it all aligns with the solar year after 19 years, 254 lunar months. It works perfectly. The math is perfect. So of course you have to believe that the sun and the moon go around the earth because the math is perfect. It just doesn't work for any of the other planets.
No.
Which is why we have retrogrades, because it doesn't work for the other planets, because sometimes those planets are moving at constant speeds.
Right.
But the Earth has its own speed, we know now, and so it's cycling around the sun rather than the sun around us. But it took thousands of years to figure this out, because the two most obvious objects in the sky to track mathematically don't reveal which is orbiting which.
Mm.
You can imagine the frustration among Europeans who knew that they had a functional cosmology, because it was just a matter of working out what the wiggle room was on 5 minor small objects, because the math is all right for the sun and moon, which are the largest obvious objects in the sky. The math works for the fixed stars. We know that precession of the equinoxes takes place and that the stars advance 1 degree. They actually move backwards 1 degree every 72 years. Like, it's just figuring out these wandering planets, and we're getting so very close. And they just keep breaking. The more accurate the observations become, telescopes, sextants, doing observations of the transit of Venus in the 1700s from multiple places on the planet Earth simultaneously. And they just keep discovering more and more things that are wrong with the cosmology. Of course, they start trusting astrology less. It's still part of all of the almanacs. It's still part of what ordinary people in the street, quote unquote, believe. There are still professional astrologers working in most major cities. But it's not built into the culture in the same way anymore. And it's not until the 20th century and newspapers that sun sign astrology really starts to become prominent. But meanwhile, the magical stuff, well, it's not an accurate representation of the universe. So how can it possibly be used to do magic? Because you're not really connecting with the real world. You're connecting with a fake and discredited model of the universe. So there's a lot of stuff in astrology that is still bound within a pre-Copernican universal model, and trying to break it free from that pre-Copernican universal model is really, really tough. The one advantage that I think that modern astrologers have is that most people don't live in a post-Copernican universe in their own heads. They still live in a pre-Copernican universe in which Earth is more or less at the center of the universe. And even though the sun goes around even though the Earth goes around the sun, Earth is still the most important thing in a gigantic 13.9 billion year old universe. Right. Like, Earth is still in the middle of it. And so naturally the planets are telling us everything that I need to know about what to do about my cat this weekend.
Right. I have to ask, Andrew, you were a magician before you consider yourself an astrologer, yes?
Absolutely.
So we need to give something to the kids here. How do you get started with doing this sort of thing? How do you do an astrology first ritual?
Start with time. I mean, a lot of ceremonial magic is about consecrating space.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to set up an altar in the middle. We are going to circle around it. We are going to do operations to 4 directions. We are going to consecrate or activate objects on the altar in the middle of this consecrated space. And we are going to activate something or cause something to happen by shouting at crystals or placing our hands on talismans or drawing out sigils in this consecrated space. We're consecrating space. Astrology begins with the assumption that space is not very interesting. Astrology begins with the assumption that time is interesting. Seasons are interesting. Days are interesting. Hours and minutes are interesting. And it's only by consecrating time rather than space that you can really begin to do astrological magic. It's kind of like that Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? You can know how fast you're going or you can know where you are, but not at both at the same time, right?
Right. Yeah.
So if somebody wants to do astrological magic, you have to shift your attention a little bit away from space, that is to say, where you are, and be concerned with how fast you're going. So the first thing that you need is some way of tracking time, and not tracking clock time, but tracking time by what nature is doing. The easiest thing to track is sunrise, wherever you are in the world. And Aleister Crowley developed this set of 4 spells. I call them the doorposts of the day. And, at dawn, you say something like, "Hail unto thee who art Ra in thy rising, even unto thee who art Ra in thy strength," et cetera, et cetera. And you are connecting yourself to the structure of the day. Do another spell like that, essentially the same wording, but with certain words, God names pulled out and other names plugged in at noon, and then again at dusk, and then again at midnight. And you're doing them also to the 4 directions. So you've got a little bit of a spatial component, but not a lot. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens if you do that spell for 6 months? Well, if you do that spell for 6 months, you always know what time it is, whether you're looking at your watch or not. Because you're tuned into what time it is. And when I was doing that on a regular basis, people would say, "What time it is it?" And I wouldn't even be looking at the clock, and I would say it's 4:06 p.m. And more often than not, it was 4:06 p.m. Or I would say 4:06 p.m. and they would say it's 4:05, and then they would watch and the hand would click over. I actually had that happen in class one day. Nice. In front of like 15 students. And is this cool moment of, I'm just a little bit ahead of the clock in terms of knowing what time it is. So sacralizing time rather than space and treating time as a thing that is worth ritualizing rather than space. I think that's where you start. The next thing that you pay attention to after you've started thinking about what time is it is, what day is it? There are lots of books that say, you should track astrological hours. Track the day. Monday is associated with the moon. Tuesday is associated with Mars. Wednesday with Mercury. Thursday with Jupiter. Friday with Venus. Saturday with Saturn. Sunday should be obvious. I just recently learned that this was such a problem in Portugal. The consecration of the days to pagan gods, that the days are just called first day, second day, third day, fourth day. Like the Roman Catholic Church decided to eliminate the use of god names for days entirely and managed to get that squeezed into the language somehow. I'm not sure that I have the history of that exactly right, but something like that happened.
Andrew, can I tell a really quick joke?
Yeah, go ahead.
So 4 Norse gods, a couple of planets, and a Roman god walk into a bar, and the bartender says, whoa, what is this, some kind of weak joke?
Oh,
weak joke.
Weak joke.
Yeah.
A weak joke.
Yes. Anyways, I apologize.
That's good. I like that.
I feel so bad now because when you talk after, it's so wonderful and so poetic. And I know you're a Toastmaster, so this is your thing. And I had to just, I befouled it. I apologize. But
No, it's fine. Planetary days. I think it's easier to start learning how to track planetary days than it is to track planetary hours as a beginner.
Right.
And as I said earlier, I did this with ties.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had to wear a jacket and tie or a sweater and a tie every day for work. So it was an easy way to incorporate magic. And silk is not a great holder of magical energy, but a finished object like a tie does hold a magical charge. Like a blank piece of silk is a great insulator. That's why it's a good idea to wrap tarot decks or runes in a piece of silk if you can afford it, or linen.
Okay.
Both materials work really well, but a finished tie has enough structure to it that it'll pick up a magical charge pretty easily. I think that that's a nice thing to do. Scarves, t-shirts, although once it gets dirty, it's a lot harder. Anyway, you're consecrating time by doing these sorts of small magical actions that build up towards astrological knowledge, because a lot of astrological knowledge is memory based.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I have a very different way of approaching a lot of astrological magic, in that I think it matters a lot what memory you hold. So I prefer to use astrological techniques in consultations with clients where I am using things that I have in memory as opposed to doing 2 hours of analysis of somebody's chart. I would rather build up a set of techniques that I know what X planet in Y sign and Y in Z house means. And I see this in this chart and I'm able to explain it in the moment. I think that's better. Maybe it's not. I think there are a lot of great astrologers out there that are doing highly detailed analysis before the session, and that's a perfectly valid way of doing it too. But from the perspective of building up an astrological magic practice, these are the beginner techniques, right? Beginning to pay attention to time. Is it between dawn and noon? Is it between noon and dusk? Is it noon, dusk to midnight? Is it midnight to dawn? Just starting with the doorposts of the day, then astrological days, then astrological nights, because you and I are recording this on Wednesday night, but it's really sun night, because the day is ruled by one planet, but the night is ruled by the planet that is 4 days before it. And so today, Wednesday, is Mercury's day, but Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night is actually Mercury's night. So now you've got day and night, and you're able to acknowledge at sundown that tonight belongs to the sun, and on Saturday you're able to say tonight belongs to Mercury. And you begin to build up a sense of what is day, what is night, what is today? Does today belong to Mercury, or does today belong to Saturn?
Right.
And certain kinds of magic are possible on a Mercury day that are not possible on a Saturn day. And similarly, some kinds of magic involving Mercury are better to do at night on Saturday night than they are to do on Wednesday day. If you are writing a business proposal, do that on a Wednesday. Take advantage of Mercury's advantage. If you are trying to write a poem that will get you laid, write that on Saturday night.
Right.
To be really clear about this and honest about this, if what you're trying to do is get laid by somebody that you are planning on standing up the following night, write that poem on Saturday night. On the other hand, if you're trying to write a love poem for somebody that you genuinely care about, that's a Friday activity.
Venus.
If you want to write a really nasty email along the lines of, I think it was J.D. Salinger's telegram, fuck you, strong letter to follow. You want to write a note that's that forceful. You're going to write that on a Friday, on a Tuesday, and you are going to write that not only on a Tuesday, but you are going to figure out how to calculate planetary hours, and you're going to write that in a Mars hour on a Mars day when Mars is in the sky.
Right.
And you are going to be badass about it. And I guarantee you that person is going to feel like they want to start a fight with you, and you will have made yourself an enemy. On the other hand, if you want to write a forceful but conciliatory note, I'm really unhappy with customer service. Season it with a little bit of diplomacy by writing it in a Jupiter hour on a Mars day, right? So now it's got, I'm really angry, but I'm prepared to be generous. What are you going to offer me as compensation for my inconvenience and trouble? Right? I'm including some diplomatic language in this, and I'm choosing a diplomatic time. The thing that I really like about this approach to astrological magic is that it has real-world practical effects.
Right.
Writing letters to people, but choosing the time at which they get sent. We create an enormous amount of correspondence. Instant messages, Instagram messages, Snapchat. There's dozens and dozens of ways that we have to communicate. But we don't pay attention to when we send these messages.
No.
For astrologers, and if you're doing magic in an astrological way, you are choosing the hour and moment of your message so that it matters. Now, you can't put off everything for 30 years until the perfect astrological moment. But you will at least do yourself a basic favor if you have to send a nasty message to wait to send it on Thursday rather than on Tuesday.
Right.
And I do have a calculator on my phone that I can look at, and it will say, oh, it's actually, I'm going to pull this out right now. The name of the program is just Hours.
Hours.
And it's on an iPhone.
Oh, there you go.
But I will pull out this program, and right now it is saying that we are in a moon hour, and the moon is at positive 12. It also has a very basic calculator that says, you know, the moon is right now in a very favorable position, or the moon is in a very poor position, and gives you some idea of its relative strength compared with other times. Positive 12 is very good, negative 8, not so great.
Right. Does this kind of stuff, if one gets good enough, does this become somewhat second nature then? I mean, for myself, and I can speak only for myself, I learned astrology, as I said, as an adjunct to my more, I'm going to say, evocatory magic. So knowing when to do things for like martial stuff, of course, that's going to be on Tuesday. And for love letters, that's obviously Friday. Does this stuff, when you come from a more astrological approach, will it start to become more natural?
It does start to become more natural. As I said earlier, there was this occasion today where I was in a store and I got talking with one of the shop clerks while I was waiting for something else to be dealt with. They were wrapping something for me. And we got to chatting, and they mentioned that they were born during a particular sun sign. And I said, do you know what your rising sign is? And they told me, and I said, oh, you were born about 4:30 in the afternoon.
Right.
But if you had asked me what astrological hour she was born in, I'm not sure that I could have told you that.
Okay.
There is a method for being able to say, okay, you were born in 1970. So what day were you born on? And then you can do a little bit of mental math, and you can say, oh, that was a Thursday.
Right.
And I have tried several times to learn and memorize that technique, and I still don't have it down. I still have to look it up. But those kinds of mathematical tricks can be learned. And a lot of people, like, this is a bit of prestidigitation. And if a stage magician does it on stage, You would not in your wildest dreams believe that that stage magician had taken 60 hours to learn how to do that on the fly in front of an audience of 500 people.
Mm-hmm.
But I promise you that stage magician spent 60 hours learning how to do that technique so that they could do it while they were also delivering their patter in front of an audience of 500 people.
Yeah.
I promise you that they have spent the time to do that. Teller of Penn and Teller. Penn is the talkative one.
Correct. Penn Jillette, yeah.
And Teller has written an article in which he says that it is not uncommon for magicians to spend dozens or hundreds of hours learning specific tricks because nobody in the audience believes that you would spend that much time learning how to do something that useless.
Right.
Right? And this is why I'm only going to be an astrologer for 10 years, because my math skills are just not that good. My language skills, my interpretive skills are excellent. But the moment I don't have the computer doing most of the calculation work for me, my skills start to break down. Now, we have stories about living Jyotish astrologers in India who are capable of doing complex 360-degree math with 60 minutes in each degree, complicated calculations of arithmetic, of stellar arithmetic in their heads without the aid of an abacus, computer, or external device. And we have stories, of course, from ancient Greece that mathematicoi, Greek astronomers, could do the same, and that Roman astronomers could do the same, and Mesopotamian astrologers could do the same. I am a great delineator, right? I am capable of seeing the chart and clicking a few buttons and seeing how it changes over time and then saying, okay, this is what I think is going to happen because this is the way that time plays out in this sort of circumstance. But if you were to ask me to do those calculations by hand, I'm not sure that I could spend the 1,000 hours to get really good at that. I don't have the 1,000 hours.
No. So paying attention to time as opposed to space, paying attention to planetary days, perhaps a little bit later on, paying more attention to planetary hours, for sure. What else do you think that people starting should start to put in their holster as they want to become more astrologically inclined with their magic?
I think you have to go back to the 7 liberal arts that we discussed earlier.
Really?
Grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.
Okay.
Here's why. Astrology is the thing that connects astronomy back to grammar. Because what you're doing is you're looking at a symbol set that is mathematically relevant in a chart, which maybe you've done the work to assemble by hand. And now you have to take this set of mathematical images and translate them into an interpretation that a lay person can understand.
Mm.
So many times I will be talking to an astrologer and they will say, oh, I've got Mars in my 12th in the 7th in Libra. And that's great that they know that piece of information. But what the hell does it mean? Right? What the hell does it mean? Do you have a story that goes with the idea of Mars in Libra in the 12th? Well, maybe this will help. Mars is the warrior or the soldier. Libra is the marketplace. And the 12th is hospitals, prisons, monasteries, and lonely places of various types and retreats and law courts. So Mars in Libra in the 12th is the mall security guard in the cafeteria.
I love it.
At 3 a.m. after all the stores have closed. This is not a favorable placement because this is a security guard with nothing to do. This is a guy who is bored. He's lonely. He is isolated. He has very few friends, and this guy is going to get himself into trouble. Either some enterprising thief is going to break into the mall through the wrong door, and this guy is going to get freaked out and shoot him in the middle of the night, or he's going to be bored and he's going to hassle a group of teenagers and somebody is going to get hurt.
Right.
This is not a great combination. So it's not just about learning the math skills. It's also about being able to translate where the planets are into a visual image, which allows you to make educated guesses about what happens next. Coming back to Penn and Teller, you can look at astrology as kind of a mental game of imagination. These planets and these positions create images, that is to say, pictures, coming back to image magic, that allow you to tell stories that have certain inferences, and there's nothing quote unquote supernatural about it at all. On the other hand, if you believe, as I do, that the planets are somehow superior intelligences, or at least non-human intelligences, and that they're interacting with us because we choose to be in relationship with them, then you can turn it on its head and say, those planets are communicating with you and telling you the stories of the people that you're reading charts for. But you have to be able to look at the chart and say, Mars is the warrior, Libra is the marketplace, and the 12th house is loneliness, or self-produced obstacles, or secret enemies, or law courts, or those kinds of places. And then you go, okay, the guard on duty in a place where nobody actually needs to be on duty.
Right.
And now you have a story to tell about that particular thing.
I love it.
Right? But a lot of it is having the memory of what these images, of what these symbols mean, and being able to translate them first into images and then into interpretation that is itself a kind of spell. I did a reading for a client about a year ago. I don't think I'm revealing all that much about this. And there was a combination in his chart which indicated very strongly that the divorce that he had literally just finished about 6 hours before our consultation had been the wrong choice. What do you say to that guy? What do you tell this person in this moment when they're like, I'm finally free of this crazy, I won't even repeat the words, I'm finally free of this person in my life, and I'm ready to start my new life. And you're like, well, this person that you have just divorced is still going to be in your life because she's the mother of your children, and you need to continue to have a relationship with her in order to have a relationship with them.
Right.
Not everybody is cut out to tell that kind of story. Not everybody is ready to tell that kind of story. Not everybody wants to be responsible for telling that story. Now what you have to do is you have to look at that chart and you have to say, there's hope. Right? There is a way for you to dissolve the anger that you currently feel towards this other person. It will take years. You will have a positive relationship with your kids again. They will not be turned against you, but it's going to require work. And you will also find love again because your story is not over. But you can't just assume that you can break all ties with the past, because time does not work that way. Right? Time is real, and time is real in a way that space is real. It's easy to say, well, it's just going into the past and it doesn't have any real effect on me. I can't see it, so it's not real. Well, it is real. Time is real. And the fact that you used to have a relationship with this woman had consequences. And those consequences are children that you love very much. Your current relationship with this person has broken. but it can be repaired with time. It's not going to look like it did before. You're both going to be poorer as a result of this choice, and you're both going to be poorer for a while.
Yeah.
But you will have a new relationship with this person, and you will have a new love relationship with somebody else. But it would be easy for you to fall into the same kinds of mistakes here. Go get therapy. And this, I think that I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
But you can get the sense that part of what astrology is supposed to do is help you understand that a whole series of choices in time have brought you to the point where you need a consultation with an astrologer. And what can an astrologer do? Well, an astrologer can look at your chart and say, oh, you need ambition, or you need love, or you need hope, or you need structure. And now there's a framework, because you've studied astrological image magic, for creating the image that helps that person move on with their life. Now, some of those images need to be physically created. You need to draw them. But as I hope I just demonstrated, sometimes you can call up the image in your mind and project it with words to the person that you're talking to.
Right.
They will see it in their own head.
Everybody can picture the security guard at the
Everybody
cafeteria.
can picture the security guard in the lonely cafeteria at 3 a.m.
Right.
And we've seen enough movies, horror movies and comedies, to know that that scene don't end well.
In either situation. Andrew, we've been talking for 2 hours.
Oh my God.
And I feel like we have just scratched the surface. I'm considering asking you if you might be keen on perhaps having a part 2 sometime down the line, 6 months, a year down the line, because we did 7 or 8 pages of notes, and I think we've literally we've talked about very little of those notes. But I'm wondering if you might be keen, if at some point a little bit further on down the line, we might be able to revisit more of these things.
Sure. Let's bring it to a close here. Part 2.
Absolutely.
Because if I look at our seven pages of notes, I see that the next thing that we should sort of talk about is moon mansions and sort of the next stage in astrological magic, which is starting to pay attention to what the moon is doing.
Right.
And for that, we should also mention that you have an episode with Chris Warnock, and that people should go and watch that or listen to that.
Yes, it's pretty good as well. We will come back and revisit astrological magic, but let's do that thing that we do on my podcast. We give some morsels to the listeners. So what would you tell people besides, well, let's give them physical things that they can bring home. So are there any books? Are there any programs? You mentioned that Hours app on your phone. What do you think people should do? Are there any courses that they should take? Should they most definitely subscribe to your Patreon to get give some snacks to the listeners, Andrew?
I would love it if they would subscribe to my Patreon, and I'm AB Watt on Patreon. You can find my website at andrewbwatt.com. As you mentioned at the start of the episode, I put out a column about every 10 days. It comes out usually around the 1st, around the 10th, and around the 20th, because that's when the sun moves from 1st, 2nd, or 3rd decan to the next one.
And we haven't even talked about decan. Like, it's one of the decans are like one of the most interesting things to me about astrology and magic, because there's this deep Egyptian connection, and we have that's going to have to wait till the next episode. But yes.
Yeah. It starts as a timekeeping technique for the middle of the night.
Yeah.
Watching when certain stars rise and going, oh, that's another 10 degrees. So that's another third of an hour.
And if it wasn't for the decans, I would have found your work. But what initially attracted me to your work is that you focus on the decans specifically for your column.
I do. And I picked that up from Austin Coppock's book, which is called 36 Faces. I was lucky enough to get one of the paperback copies. I suspect that
one of 15, who knows?
I don't know how many copies there were, but I have this weird suspicion that someday my copy, which is so beat up and covered in notes, might actually be valuable, not because it's one of Austin Coppock's first editions, but because it's got my notes in it.
There you go.
That's the sort of thing I'm hoping for. But 36 Faces is currently between print runs, and the cost for the first edition is astronomical. And I would not pay for that because Austin has been at work on second edition for at least 2 years now. And he keeps promising that it'll be out any week now, but I think the current expectation is that it will be released at NORWAC, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, and that's just in a few weeks.
Right.
So wait for the second edition to come out, but do go to his website, which is austincoppock.com, sign up for the email alert that the book is out, and buy a copy when it comes out.
For sure.
Chris Warnock's book, The Mansions of the Moon, has illustrations by Nigel Jackson of all 28 images of the Mansions of the Moon. They are brilliant. I gotta say, at one point I tried hiring 2 different artists for doing my own set of illustrations for the decans. And it is not effective to hire somebody who is not magically operant.
Okay.
And I say this, like, you might think, oh, I should really hire a friend of mine to do this work for me. No. This is potentially dangerous to the person who draws the images. And you, as a magically operant person, have better protections than somebody who is just drawing them because they're getting a commission. Don't do that to a friend, and don't do that to anyone, really.
No.
Learn to draw yourself. We already talked about a couple of basic books for learning how to draw. I started with Sachiko Umoto, Japanese lady whose works have been translated into English. Her illustrations are cutesy, and they're, if you're all black, all goth, all the time, edgelord, you're going to look at these illustrations and you're going to go, oh, this is not magic. And I promise you that it is.
Okay.
Ed Emberley is another good person to start with for basic drawing lessons. Mostly what you have to remember is that most drawings are really just combinations of boxes and lines. And some of the boxes are circles or squares or pentagons or octagons, and some of them are more vague wiggles, but they're all just collections of lines, or you can do it with blocks of color. Take a drawing class, take a painting class. 1, you'll be learning a real world skill. 2, you will be learning how artists think. My friend Dave Gray, who is not a magician specifically, says drawing is thinking. And Dave Gray has a number of videos out, which I think you can find on YouTube, in which he teaches you how to draw in 8 minutes. I'll see if I can find a link, Doug, and I'll send it to you for show notes.
Shall be in the show notes for sure.
What other books do I think are good places? Picatrix, of course, is sort of the keystone book. There's a Dan Astrell translation. Chris Warnock and John Michael Greer collaborated on a translation. Scott Gosnell has put out a translation of On the Shadow of the Ideas, which is Giordano Bruno's book.
Right.
Which contains a massive number of astrological images in it. And as we mentioned, also separates out the images from the descriptions of what they do. Eric Perdue has done the recent translation of 3 books of occult philosophy, which also contains these same kinds of lists of decans and Mansion of the Moon images, and also separated out what those images mean and what they do. I feel like I'm forgetting an important book, but
there's one written by somebody by the name of A. Watt, A Full Volume of Splendor and Starlight.
So this is a little bit different, because what I did for my first decans walk is I wrote a poem for every single decan. Each poem is 30 lines. So there's an invocation to the spirit of the decan. There is a second verse is usually a description of the image, but in poetic language. And then the third is both an explanation of what that spirit does and a petition to ask for that power or a potential. So a full volume of Starlight and Splendor is available through my Etsy website as a downloadable PDF. You can decide whether or not you want to print it yourself. And you have full publishing rights to have a printed copy, printed at your local print shop, spiral bind it. It's a whole lot easier than me physically shipping it to you. And it saves a lot on costs. And you can also decide how fancy of a binding you want to do. If you want to learn book binding, you can do that. But it contains all of the astrological poetry that I had written at the time of publication, which is hymns to all of the decans, hymns to the angels of the mansions of the moon, a bunch of constellations, all 9 planets. The 7 hymns of the visible planets are available on my website as the Neo-Orphic hymns. All of the Behenian stars as well are in there. And those are the 15 root stars that are the first magnitude or better stars in the night sky. Almost all of them in the northern hemisphere. All good places to start.
Andrew, where can people find your work?
I'm at andrewbwatt.com. There's links to the Etsy website from there and also to the Patreon and Ko-fi.com websites. And
you doing consultations?
And I am doing consultations. I've just set up a new service.
Okay.
The new service is that learning whether or not you want to work with an astrologer is a very personal decision. So I now have a consultation of 10 minutes that you can sign up and get a free consultation on any Tuesday during my regular business hours. Talk with me, decide whether or not you want to sign up for a full paid consultation. You get a little bit of one-on-one time with me and decide whether or not this is something you want to pursue on a deeper level. And the sign-up service is through the service and classes link on my page.
Got it. And we did mention that you have a little horoscope there for each one of the decans. What is the difference between what you put up on your blog for free and what you give for MailChimp subscribers as well as Patreon subscribers? Give us what people get for free, Andrew, and give us what people get for paid, Andrew. Paid, awesome, cool. I'm a member. I love it. Andrew is who I get most of my I'm just going to say I get most of my astrological information from you and from this column.
I think that I write a full column each month or every 10 days, roughly. First decan of any sign. So Aries 1, Taurus 1 are out. Gemini 1 is going to come out probably on the 20th, which is Saturday.
Yeah.
I don't know if when this episode will be out, but
it's going to be after. Yeah, way after. It'll be towards the end of May.
And so that column consists of an analysis of what the decan is about, and then an analysis of the planets' placements, and then a horoscope for each sun sign. Decan 2 is available only to subscribers at the $3 level or above. And then Decan 3 goes out to my Patreon subscribers for free. And I also provide it for anybody who signs up for my MailChimp account. So it's not available on the website, but you get a link to a downloadable PDF or to a password protected blog entry, and you can read it for free. But you have to be in either the Patreon or you have to be a MailChimp subscriber so that I know how to reach you and I can provide additional information when I write extra stuff from time to time. Patreon subscribers at higher levels, I really only have one, also get access to a course on magic that I wrote over the last 2 years, which is Greek mythology, the basics of how to be an astrologer, some more stuff about image magic, and a bunch of stuff about geometry for magic, which I hope people will find useful.
Fantastic. I will have all of the links for where to find Andrew's work on the internet, his blog, as well as his Patreon account. Those will all be available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also there, you will find show notes. The show notes to this one, there's going to be a lot of them. It's going to be, for the most part, most of what we talked about today. And then when we get the second part of this episode, there's going to be a bit more practical stuff there. But please head to whatmagicisthis.com and have a look at the show notes, as well as find all of Andrew's things. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find a link to my Instagram account, my Facebook account, and then my Twitter account. I'm most active on the Twitter, less so on Instagram, and even less so on Facebook. But yes, if you want to follow me on any one of those 3 bits of social media, head there. Do you think that I'm doing something kind of fun here with What Magic Is This, and you'd like to show your support in some way? I have 3 ways of doing so. Let's go through them. The very first way is the best way, and that is Patreon. So patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find any number of the support me on Patreon buttons. There's a lot of them. I've peppered them all over my website because I do need your support, and it is only $7 a month. I have one tier. It is either you support the show and support what I do, or you do not, and you're just kind of on the sidelines there cheering me on, which I appreciate. But what I appreciate more is if you are an actual member of my Patreon account. I basically have a whole different podcast that I produce for the Patreon subscribers. Now, a lot of people, when they do Patreon stuff, it's just like, oh, you just get episodes early, or oh, you get an extended interview. I do full episodes, full-length episodes. That's like a whole different podcast. As I said, I just put out a video, which was a bit experimental. It's kind of a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I still had a bit of fun with it, about how one can perhaps go and experience fairy, both fairy as a phenomena, as well as the land of fairy. So people have enjoyed that video so far. I had a great time making it. It took a couple of months to finish, but I did finish it anyhow. Basically, what I'm trying to say is if you support me on Patreon at $7 a month, you get a whole different show. I produce as much stuff on that Patreon as I do for this podcast that you're listening to now. It is well worth the money. $7 is nothing. That is peanuts. That is so little. And it goes to a good cause, which is keeping me alive and being able to eat food. And every once in a while, I might be able to buy a carton of milk. 3% milk. But if you do want to support my show, the best way of doing that is on Patreon. A whole different podcast. I talk about all kinds of things. It's really wonderful. So $7 a month, head there. And please support what I do. The second way of supporting is through PayPal. You know the steez. You just go to PayPal and you send some money. All of the links to PayPal are on whatmagicisthis.com. $5, $10, $20, any amount helps. It all goes back into keeping the fires here at What Magic Is This lit and fueled, because doing podcasting is expensive. It's not cheap. It's getting more expensive with every month, seemingly. But if you support me through PayPal, I would greatly appreciate it. Again, any amount helps, and it all goes back into making this podcast what it is. The third way of supporting is showing your support by grabbing a t-shirt or a hoodie or a mug or a notebook. I love the notebooks, or a tote bag or a laptop case. There's so many things. Did I mention coffee mugs? I might have mentioned mugs. Stickers, fridge magnets, so many things. I've got about 9 designs. They all say, what magic is this? And yes, you get it. You can walk around and do your own thing while wearing something of mine. And you look great. I don't get a ton of money from those things, but it's always lovely to see people wearing my stuff. If you do buy anything from the merch store, please send me a picture. I really appreciate it. Head to whatmagicisthis.com. Glow to the menu. Go to the menu there, click on the menu, click on merchandise, and yes, you can find anything there. But all of these ways of supporting me are at whatmagicisthis.com. Best way of supporting me, though, Patreon, $7 a month. That's my only tier. It's like a whole different podcast, and it's just as much fun. And dare I say, I really think that it is my best work is over on the Patreon. Anyhow, we'll see you over there. All of these things are at whatmagicisthis.com. Andrew, as I said, we're going to have to do a part 2 of this one. We have barely scratched the surface, but my goodness, there is so much to take from this episode. And so we will definitely, because time is a real thing, and because we have to give some space to time, maybe we'll check back in with you towards the end of the year, or we will definitely have to have you back on, maybe even before the year runs out. But this has been an absolute pleasure.
We'll see. The window of time will open. Let's end with Marsilio Ficino.
Definitely, please.
These celestial bodies are not to be found outside us in some other place, for the heavens in their entirety are within us, in whom the light of life and the origin of heaven dwell. If you temper within yourself the heavenly signs and the heavenly gifts, you will flee far from all the menaces of the fates, and without doubt lead a blameless life under divine auspices.
Fantastic. That was the one and only Marsilio Ficino. This has been the one and only Andrew Watt, and I am Douglas Batchelor. Come on back to What Magic Is This? We'll talk about more of this magic stuff. I know we threw a lot at you this episode, but guess what? Be prepared, because the next one, there's going to be even more. So until then, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until then, goodbye, everybody. Ta-ta.